Hi there, I'm a man in my early 50s. It's amusing, when I share my life story with people, I often get responses like, "Really? How did you pull that off?" It seems my journey is quite unique. I mean, I've yet to meet someone who's experienced what I have. In fact, some people find my story so unbelievable, they think I'm making it up. I understand it's hard to comprehend something fully if you haven't experienced it firsthand. In my case, only a handful of people have braved the storms I've weathered. I want to share my story with you, the raw and unfiltered truth. I hope you can put yourself in my place for a while and imagine what my life has been like. Let's start with a little background. So, I'm a physician working in a hospital. Honestly, I've always been kind of a brainiac. School was a breeze for me, always aced my tests. That led me to a pretty decent job and, well, marriage. Let me clarify that. I ended up tying the knot with my college sweetheart, Hannah. I never really had the guts to call it quits, so we just sort of ended up married. I won't sugarcoat it and say we were head over heels in love or anything. It wasn't that kind of marriage. It was more like a, yikes, you're pregnant. Guess we gotta get hitched kind of deal. I didn't want to leave her high and dry, especially once we found out about the baby. It could have completely ruined her life, and I didn't want that burden. So, we ended up tying the knot in a hasty ceremony. From the get-go, my parents weren't exactly her biggest supporters. They didn't think she was the right fit for me. They were aware of her less than stellar family background. She didn't have a high-flying job. She wasn't pulling in a hefty salary. She was just an average office worker with a modest income. There were instances when she'd leave our home in tears after a visit. I'd always defend my wife when my mom overstepped. We had our fair share of arguments over it. As the years passed, I grew older and my mom became more delicate. She lost the fiery spirit she once had. I guess my wife's voice became more assertive and louder over time. We had our first and only child, a girl we named Kendall. Before I knew it, she was off to middle school. I was working long hours at the hospital to keep us financially stable. I was doing everything I could to provide. My wife was equally occupied at home, raising our child and managing the household. We tried to live a simple life. From time to time, my wife would socialize with some of the other hospital wives. She had a thing for golf, and she was pretty good at it too. I was absolutely rubbish at it, so I never tagged along. My thing was hiking. I'd hit the trails and capture some shots. Nature photography was my thing. We were a bit different in terms of personality too. She thrived in a crowd. I was more of a lone ranger or maybe just a one-on-one kind of guy. Anything more than that, and I'd start feeling socially overwhelmed. But that was about the extent of our differences. They never really sparked any friction between us. Even by average standards, we were pretty run-of-the-mill. We led simple lives and were satisfied with that. But as time rolled on, that satisfaction started to fade and a gap began to form between my wife and me. The crux of it all was my relationship with my wife's family. She hailed from a large family, a whole bunch of siblings. I didn't even know about it until after we got hitched. She was the eldest. She had 4 younger brothers and 5 younger sisters. They were a lot to handle. And now, technically, they were my lot to handle too. I won't tire you with the details of their issues. Honestly, there aren't enough hours in the day to delve into all the drama they whipped up. They were always short on cash growing up and even now. Somehow, they'd always rope my wife into their predicaments, and it fell on me to shell out the cash to resolve their problems. Being a physician, I was pulling in a decent paycheck. But that doesn't mean I could keep doling out cash to them. Sometimes, it wasn't even about the money. I just didn't have the bandwidth to clean up their messes. I was working round the clock. Even after my shift, there were conferences, meetings with colleagues. Barely a moment to myself to chill, let alone fret about them. Being a doc is as hectic as you'd think. All day, I'd dream about hitting home and crashing in my own bed. But that wasn't my reality. I wanted to come home to my lovely daughter's smile. I wanted to step into the kitchen and be hit by the aroma of my wife's amazing cooking. I wanted to kick back, loosen my tie, and have my wife knead the tension out of my shoulders. But none of that ever happened. Instead, the moment I'd hit home, I'd find my wife at the kitchen table, ready to drop the bomb that her brother's in hot water again. What are we going to do? That was my reality. The moment I'd hear the word brother from my wife's lips, I could feel a wave of icy pain wash over my head. If things ended with me just handing over some cash, I wouldn't be here chatting with you. It wasn't that simple. There are some problems that money just can't fix. This was one of them. As I said before, I was nothing more than a safety net they'd fall back on when they screwed up. That was pretty much the extent of our relationship. I never hung out with them or spent time with them beyond handing over cash. One day, I wasn't feeling too hot. My stomach had been acting up, so I decided to get it checked. After an endoscopy, I was told I had a stomach ulcer. These days, it's not uncommon to hear about folks getting diagnosed with all sorts of stomach issues like fatty liver or gastritis. A stomach ulcer can be a real pain, literally. It's something a lot of people have dealt with. The symptoms can be pretty rough, so it's crucial for the person dealing with it to get the support and care they need from their family, if possible. After the checkup, I headed back to an empty house. My daughter was out with her buddies and my wife was nowhere to be seen. I whipped up a meal for myself and was just sitting down to eat when my wife walked in. She was decked out in her golf gear. When I asked her where she'd been, she said, "Oh, just played a few rounds with the hospital director's wife." I could have guessed that much just by looking at her. They'd been getting pretty chummy lately. The hospital director's wife seemed to have taken a shine to her. I was happy to hear that. What I wasn't thrilled about was what she said next. I told her about my stomach ulcer. I mentioned that I'd probably need to get admitted to the hospital for treatment. I mentioned that things could potentially get worse. My wife listened to me as if I was just telling her about my day, totally uninterested. She just said, "All right, so you'll go to your hospital, right? The nurses there are good. They'll take care of you. I'm beat. I'm heading upstairs to sleep." Her lack of concern really stung. Our marriage was hanging by a thread. I never wanted the kind of lovey-dovey marriage you see in movies, the kind that gives you butterflies in your stomach. But at the very least, I hoped that when I shared my health concerns with my family, they'd show some worry. I don't think that's too much to ask. My wife's indifference towards me was a heavy burden on my heart. It just didn't sit well with me. I had to let it all out. What am I to you? Just a workhorse that keeps this family afloat? Or am I just your go-to guy to clean up all the messes your family makes? I can't believe how much you've changed. You care more about golfing than my health. Your priorities are all mixed up. What's the point of me working my fingers to the bone if you're just going to treat me like this? What do you have to say for yourself? I thought my wife would apologize. I was pretty heated. Instead, she just gazed at me and burst into laughter. She tried to downplay it as if I was making a mountain out of a molehill. "Wow, you need a drink or something to cool off? If you're going to be this moody, just hit the sack. Like I said, I'm beat. I'm going to shower and then crash." That was the moment my affection for my wife totally vanished. From that day forward, my wife and I barely spoke. Eventually, an event led us to live separately. She loaned a substantial amount of money to her family behind my back. Apparently, she'd made a down payment on a rural house for them. They'd decided they wanted a shared cabin for summer retreats. One of her siblings even planned to permanently reside there after retirement. I discovered this and went over to see if I could recover any of the money she'd handed them. I was as clear as day. They needed to give back that money because she had no authority to distribute it. Instead of apologizing, they thought I was blowing things out of proportion and were annoyed that I was demanding the money back. If it wasn't illegal, I would have physically confronted each of them. But I held back. What would my daughter think if her dad landed in jail for fighting with her aunts and uncles? In the end, I decided this was the final straw, and from that day forward, I would live separately from my wife. I felt awful for my daughter. She was at that age where she was aware of what was happening, but still too young to fully comprehend or handle it. She silently observed as the emotional chasm between her parents widened. The day arrived for me to move out. I had my bags packed and ready at the front door, poised to start my new life. But before I could leave, my wife delivered the final blow. She declared that divorce was off the table and that I'd need to pay child support. Money was her endgame, even at this point. In that moment, I wanted to shake some sense into her. But being an optimist, I tried to find the silver lining. I adored my daughter, so I didn't mind providing for her. Financially, this was actually the best outcome. The only money my wife could access was the child support I sent. She couldn't touch the rest of my earnings. I rented a studio apartment near the hospital and embarked on my solo journey. It was a bitter pill to swallow, sending money to my wife, but knowing it was for my daughter made it a little easier to bear. Even though I held a grudge against her, I truly felt that women generally have a better instinct when it comes to raising children. Additionally, it might be more beneficial for a daughter to have her mother close by. I believed it was a more favorable outcome than if my wife had been the one to walk away. I assumed my wife was pleased with receiving money from me without having to live under the same roof. That's probably why she didn't push for a divorce. I had to ponder whether that was the best course of action or not. Before I realized it, a year had flown by since I began my solo living, and my job consumed most of my thoughts. Work was incredibly demanding, and I started undergoing treatment for my stomach issues. Even though my wife and I were living apart, I still had the chance to see my daughter occasionally when I visited. My wife would sometimes pop into the room while my daughter and I were spending time together. I always ensured to maintain a cordial atmosphere for the sake of my daughter. It could have been my imagination, but I sensed a slight improvement in the relationship between my wife and I. Perhaps it was a case of you don't know what you've got until it's gone. Maybe her expectations of how things would turn out were different from the actual reality, and I thought maybe she felt the same way, even if it wasn't to the same degree as me. I was naive to think she had changed, though. I should have known that people can't truly change their nature. No matter how things appeared or how she made things appear, she never really changed at all. One day, she texted me saying she wanted to meet. I suggested we go to the cafe in my hospital where we used to catch up often. Instead, she said she wanted to meet somewhere quiet. She preferred to meet somewhere outdoors, like a park. Honestly, I wasn't comfortable in places I wasn't used to. I didn't like being around other people as it is, especially if it was somewhere new and I didn't know anyone. I had a bit of social anxiety. I liked meeting in the hospital because it was a familiar environment, and I don't know. I just felt more at ease there. I agreed to meet her where she wanted. When I got there, she pulled a manila envelope out of her bag and took out some documents. My heart was pounding. I asked her if that was what I thought it was, and she said yes. I said, "Why now? What changed?" Things have felt less stressful in the past year that we've been apart. I've come to understand the significance of family, and I thought you shared that sentiment. But you haven't felt any of that, have you? She just looked at the papers and said nothing. I pressed on. "Is there another guy in the picture?" She stayed mum. "Don't just sit there in silence. I deserve to know what's going on in your mind. If there's someone else, does Kendall know?" She finally broke her silence. "There's no one else. It's just that being with you has become too overwhelming." I was at a loss for words. I told her I needed time to process it all, and I did. Is this abrupt divorce really the solution? Is continuing to live separately the best course of action? My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. If we go through with the divorce, what will become of our daughter? That was my primary concern. My parents had actually broached the subject of divorce some time ago. I was in my early 50s, but I had a stable job. Remarriage at this age wouldn't be out of the question. But to be honest, remarriage wasn't really on my radar. I didn't see it happening. Even if I did get divorced, I was fine with maintaining the status quo. I could still spend time with my daughter and my wife, but the stress my wife was experiencing from my constant presence wouldn't be a problem like before. I was well aware that my wife wasn't going to have a change of heart. I had no other option but to brace myself for the likelihood of a divorce. A couple of nights later, I found myself at a local pub with a close buddy of mine. He was well versed in the saga of my family life. I shared with him that a divorce seemed to be on the horizon. He voiced his support for the idea and urged me to get it done sooner rather than later. "Dragging it out will only complicate things," he advised. His words resonated with me. After our chat, I was leaning towards the decision to part ways with my wife. We splurged on a bottle of premium whiskey and spent the night at the bar until the bottle was nearly empty. I think most men would agree that a good drink and a trusted friend can help solve just about any problem. That night, we were like carefree youngsters again, laughing and enjoying ourselves immensely. The following morning, however, was a stark contrast. I woke up with a splitting headache, as if someone had taken an axe to my skull. I checked my phone to find a text from my friend. "Today marks the beginning of your new journey. You've got this. Leave the past behind." With a groan, I forced myself out of bed and headed to the hospital. That night, I recall getting a call for an emergency case that I had to handle. Normally, I wouldn't be assigned to such cases, but we were short-staffed at the time. The doctor who usually handles emergency admissions was off that night, so I was filling in. When an ambulance speeds up to the ER doors, you never really know what you're going to face. It was a pretty calm night. The hospital was patient-free, and there were no visits. As a doctor, that's a good sign. It means everyone is safe and healthy. Since it was a slow night, I decided to catch some shut-eye in a bed in the on-call room. I was awakened by an emergency call. It was for a patient involved in a car accident and was being transported by ambulance. The patient was a woman in her 40s. I skimmed through the patient's chart as I hurried down the stairs. The paramedics who arrived at the accident scene had given her initial treatment. According to them, she was stable but injured. Knowing her condition wasn't life-threatening eased my mind a bit. I headed to her bed. When I drew back the curtain and saw who was lying there, I almost fell to the ground. There she was, dressed in high-end clothes and adorned with pricey jewelry. It was my wife. There she was, wailing in agony right in front of me. What was she doing out at this hour, dressed like that? Her legs had taken a serious hit from the crash. This was my first time seeing my wife in any of these clothes. Where and when did she acquire all these high-end items? I couldn't afford to focus on her attire. My top priority was evaluating her condition. Her clothes and bed were soaked in blood. I immediately ordered a sedative for her while I had the emergency responder fill me in on the accident details. It was confirmed that she was in a car collision with another vehicle and had suffered a significant leg injury. Next, I had to visually inspect my wife's injuries. This meant she either had to remove her pants or I'd have to cut them off. There was too much blood, causing her pants to stick to her leg, so I had no choice but to cut them. I knew she wouldn't be pleased since they seemed really pricey. I wanted to get my wife's approval before I damaged her clothes. As she was writhing in pain, she told me, "Don't dare touch my clothes with those scissors." A nurse with me recognized her. She asked, "Isn't that your wife?" I didn't bother answering a question to which she already knew the answer. I told her, "Listen, I need to evaluate your injuries. There's a lot of blood, which is obscuring the severity of your wound. Your pants are adhering to your leg. I must cut them off." My wife let out a loud shriek in opposition. "Take me to a different hospital. Don't lay a finger on me." Despite the risk of fainting from blood loss, she still had the strength to yell like that. It was challenging for me to comprehend everything that was happening. I informed her, "If you don't get treated right away, you could suffer lasting damage. Technically, I don't need your consent to do this. I'm asking out of courtesy. Are your clothes more valuable than your life?" I think the pain finally got through to her. She nodded and weakly muttered, "Fine." I used the scissors to remove her pants and examine her wound. I gasped, but not because of the injury. Now I understood why she insisted on going to another hospital. She didn't want me to see her lower body. As I cut her pants, I noticed a tattoo that read 3S. I was speechless, but I couldn't dwell on that. I had to attend to her. She was rushed into emergency surgery. A few hours later, I visited her room to see how she was doing. Around that time, her mom and dad showed up at the hospital. I informed her mother that Hannah was stable. She burst into tears and thanked me for looking after her daughter. Then she tried to sway my opinion about our current situation. She inquired if there was any possibility that Hannah and I could mend our marriage. She was under the misconception that I had done something that led to me being ousted from the house and living separately from Hannah. I figured it would be futile to clarify the real circumstances to her, so I didn't. I also didn't respond to her question about reconciling with Hannah. They left the hospital shortly after. I turned to my wife and said, "I know you're not asleep." She opened her eyes and gazed at me. The anesthesia should have worn off by then, which means she must have been in discomfort. Yet, she managed to feign sleep when her parents were present. I questioned her about the tattoo. "Who is S? Clearly it's not me." She remained silent. The H was obviously for my wife's name. I was clueless about who S was. She appeared to have no intention of answering my query. "Your mother believes I did something to wreck our marriage. I won't agree to a divorce until she understands the real situation. I'm going to spill the beans about your tattoo and let you handle the fallout with your family. The only way I'll consent to a divorce is if your family knows that you're the one who messed things up, not me." My wife burst into tears. She pleaded with me not to involve her family. She promised she'd spill the truth. She confessed that she met another man before we started living separately. The problem was who this man was and how she met him. It turned out to be someone my close friend, who I had just hung out with the previous night, knew. He was a successful entrepreneur that my friend was familiar with. Obviously, my friend would never have introduced them if he knew what would transpire. He didn't introduce her to his friend with the intention of sparking an affair. One evening, my wife happened to be at the same restaurant as them. When she approached to greet my friend, he introduced her to the other man. They didn't kick off the affair immediately. Initially, they were just friendly acquaintances. However, with each meeting, she found herself increasingly drawn to him. He was successful and treated her kindly. Conversely, she loathed every interaction with me and detested our marriage once we began living separately. She started seeing him more frequently. She confessed that every time they met, he would give her money. And it wasn't just a small amount, it was significantly more than what I was sending her. I could feel my blood simmering as I listened to her. Once I was out of the house and out of sight, their affair took off. They both knew they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. They were causing irreparable harm. The night their affair began, the businessman suggested we should get matching tattoos. Initially, my wife resisted, but the businessman persisted, arguing, "You don't love me. If you do, prove it." He claimed that if she got a tattoo of his initial, it would push her to divorce me, and they could be together. Despite her reservations, she agreed. That night, they went to a tattoo shop and got identical tattoos. I was speechless after hearing her story. I just stared at the floor in silence. I had spent every moment of my life working tirelessly to support her and our family. I felt like I was aimlessly floating in the middle of the ocean. She then revealed the real cause of her accident. She was driving home after meeting him, texting while driving, and got hit after running a red light. Now, I knew the whole truth. Now, I had a valid reason to finally divorce her. Fortunately, I had the foresight to record our entire conversation. It was my only safeguard against her potentially twisting her story or pinning the blame on me for the divorce. I had to snap out of being her husband and resume my role as a doctor. I treated my wife as I would any other patient. She was discharged from the hospital the next day. I met up with my friend and confronted him about what my wife had revealed. I asked him if he was aware of the relationship between her and his friend. As soon as I asked, he began to shake. I knew right away from his reaction. He admitted he had suspicions they might be seeing each other after he introduced them. He insisted he never expected them to start an affair. He apologized over and over. When I questioned why he hadn't informed me sooner, he said he was concerned about how I would react. He admitted he suspected they were growing close and something might be happening. He thought the news would be too much for me to bear, so he chose to stay silent. I landed a punch right on his face. "What kind of friend does that? How could you keep this from me?" I yelled at him. His face was a mix of blood and tears. From the floor, he clung to my leg, pleading for my forgiveness. There we were, two men in our 50s, brawling on the floor of a high-end cocktail bar. The bar staff rushed over to intervene. All eyes in the bar were on us, but I couldn't care less about the onlookers. My friend was begging for forgiveness, admitting he'd made a colossal error and should have foreseen the consequences. He accepted full responsibility in an attempt to make amends. He handed me the businessman's contact details. I was determined to confront him about his despicable act of seducing another man's wife. My heart pounded as I dialed the number. This is Hannah's husband. Am I speaking to the lowlife who's trying to force a divorce so he can swoop in and marry my wife? Better get a good lawyer, because I'm going to sue you for every penny you've got. He was taken aback and tried to claim I had the wrong number before hanging up. I recorded our brief exchange. What a spineless act. I expected him to at least have the guts to stay on the line and face the music. He sounded terrified. This was the man my wife intended to leave me for. Pathetic. A few moments later, I received a text. It was from him. "Don't contact me again. If you do, I'll report you to the police for harassment." He was avoiding the consequences of his actions. He was a homewrecker and a coward, trying to escape the reality of his deeds. What a weasel. His text was the last straw for me. I went directly to my wife's parents to expose the truth. They needed to understand the real character of their daughter. At the very least, I wanted them to know that I wasn't the cause of our impending divorce. I laid it all out for her mother. I'm not the one driving this divorce, she is. I won't be paying a single cent in the divorce settlement. She's already got the divorce papers drawn up. She showed them to me the other day. All I need to do is sign, and it's done. Please let Hannah know once she's recovered. I had said my piece. I waited for her response. I half expected her to explode with anger. She was livid, both at her daughter's actions and the lies about me being the cause of the divorce. Her father had a request, man to man. Please let this go just this once. I was ready for that. Let it go? I've been the one bailing your family out of trouble for years. I don't even want to think about all the money I've wasted cleaning up your messes. Not once did I receive a thank you for any of it. I can see right through you. You're terrified, aren't you? Your personal ATM is shutting down and you're out of luck the next time you inevitably land yourselves in a pickle. This is the end of the line. I'm finished. I've selflessly bailed you out time after time. Those days are gone. I want nothing more to do with any of you. I've been itching to say that for years. It felt like a massive burden lifted off my shoulders. The divorce followed shortly after, and I ended up with custody of Kendall. Given my financial stability and income, it made sense. Kendall was old enough to understand the situation. She had figured out her mother was having an affair long before I did. I was concerned about the impact this would have on her, given her impressionable age. Thankfully, she seems to be coping well. She's thriving at school and frequently hangs out with her friends. In fact, she even takes on the role of a mother in the house, occasionally cooking dinner for me when I get home late from the hospital. She's working hard at school and proving to me that she's a responsible kid. I couldn't be prouder of her. My ex-wife reaches out to me every now and then, aside from the times we have to see each other when she comes to pick up Kendall for the weekend. She's been hinting at wanting to spend more time with me. Naturally, I flatly declined. I think there was a moment post-divorce when she truly fell for me. It dawned on her. She had recklessly thrown away everything she had. I won't deny that there was a time when I loved her too. I toyed with the idea that maybe it wouldn't be so bad to meet her once and hear what she had to say. Just kidding. That was never on the cards. Even if she passed away, I wouldn't feel a thing. I couldn't care less about her words, her life, or anything related to her. I was clueless about her current life. And frankly, I didn't want to know. However, I did get an update from my friend about the spineless businessman. Apparently his company tanked, and he's now jobless. Seems like a fitting end for such a scumbag. What goes around comes around. If he didn't believe in karma before, I bet he's a believer now. Don't get me wrong, I'm no saint. Never claimed to be. I've always tried to treat people fairly, though. I never want to inflict the kind of pain I've experienced on anyone else. I'm waiting for the day my good karma circles back to me. Until then, I'll do my best to be a good dad to my daughter and lead an honest life with her. Thanks a ton for sticking around till the end. Drop a comment if you enjoyed my story and took away something from it.